Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
Hey there, welcome back to this week's episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. This week, we're discussing how to use mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches to overcome chronic pain. My guest this week is Vidyamala Burch. She is a mindfulness and compassion teacher with over 25 years helping people with pain, illness, or stress live fuller and more meaningful lives. At the early age of 17, she sustained a spinal injury that required multiple surgeries and left her with chronic low back pain and partial paraplegia. After experiencing a period of hopelessness as well as helplessness, she discovered mindfulness as a way to ease the mental torment associated with physical pain. She's the author of 2 books, teaches and trains on the topics of mindfulness as well as compassion. Vidyamala was also awarded an honorary membership from the British Pain Society for her outstanding contribution to the field of pain management. On today's episode, we discuss how Vidyamala has used mindfulness to overcome chronic pain and how she teaches people with chronic pain to live fuller lives through mindfulness meditation. Okay, without further ado, let's begin and let's learn about mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches to chronic pain. Hi, Vidyamala. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Great to be with you, Joe. Thanks for having me.
I've been a follower of your work for a long time, probably in the early days when I started venturing into the mindfulness space and starting to kind of seed it into my practice and use it with myself, and of course, use it with patients. I think it's almost like a secret that we have as practitioners. Like we start to use it first with ourselves, and then we kind of get comfortable, and then we use it with our patients. And we need to reverse a little bit of that, probably use it with people who are suffering more, and of course, apply it to ourselves as well. I know in the beginning of your journey, there's a bit of your own suffering that took you a while to explore and open up to. I know mindfulness was a big part of that. Can you bring us back to that time and talk to us about what that was like?
Yeah, so thanks. So I injured my spine when I was 16, which is a very long time ago now. And I ended up with chronic pain, persistent pain, ended up with disability. This was back in New Zealand in the 80s, and really there was no help whatsoever to deal with the more sort of mental, emotional side of it. In fact, there wasn't much help, period. And then about 12 years after that, so I had my original injury, then I had a car crash and fractured another part of my spine. So I was not a good place. And then about 12 years later, I was exploring lots of things. I was trying yoga, trying diet. I was just trying anything to get a handle on my situation. And I stumbled upon a Buddhist weekend retreat. So I went on that and was taught to meditate. And I intuited, it was more intuitive than anything else, but I intuited that it was going to be possible to use my mind to help me ease my pain, rather than having a mind that seemed to ramp up my pain, which was my experience then. I had this quite direct sort of intuition that my mind was a tool that I could potentially train to be a resource in my journey of living with chronic pain. So that was way back in 1987. I then moved to the UK in 1990, and I lived in a retreat center, a meditation retreat center, for 5 years, which was very intensive training in working with the mind. And then around about 2000, I decided to see if I could develop a program to help other people living with chronic pain, chronic health conditions of any sort. And that was the beginning of Breathworks, which is the program that I now run. Originally, I just started out running, a couple of courses a week, experimenting, trying things out. And after a number of years, really, of that more experimental, exploratory phase, developing a program that we've now got a very good evidence base for, helped hundreds of thousands of people. And I think the thing that brings me the greatest satisfaction and the greatest joy, really, is just knowing that I'm helping people. I think back to myself as a young woman lying in a hospital bed, really with not much no support in terms of how to work with the mental and emotional side of my situation. And I don't want anyone else to be in that situation. So if my program can help some people get their lives back and learn to work with their minds, then of course I'm very, very satisfied.
So I'm just curious, around this time that you're exploring mindfulness, so back in the early days where you're just starting to get into it, before you went on that long retreat, and you're opening up and you're becoming aware of this idea that the mind can be an asset in your recovery, were you also aware of maybe the negative implications or the negative impact that the mind could have on your current state and what that meant for your future recovery?
That's a really great question. And I think, to be honest, not really, because I wasn't aware, because it even takes awareness to know that your mind's not helping you. I think I was more in a state of denial and confusion, but there must have been some kind of intuition of that, because I quite quickly really sort of plunged into working with my mind, looking at the mind, understanding the mind, and training the mind. So I must have intuitively known that not doing that was not serving me well, and to do that would serve me well. But really, I was confused and not very aware of anything at that time.
And how long did it take for you to come out of that fog, so to speak, and where you started to say, wow, this is actually helping me. I feel less stressed. I have less pain. I'm sleeping better. I'm thinking more clear. I'm able to obviously focus and concentrate on things, because pain can really pull your focus in life.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very multi-layered. So really quite quickly, I would have experienced some benefit. But looking back, that was very superficial. And then, of course, when you start working with your mind, what's interesting is it's not a steady, smooth path, as I'm sure you might have realized through your own practice. So you think you're making progress, and then there's another layer that arises to integrate and to work through. So it's a bit like a wave motion, I would say. You have a period where it all seems to be going well, and then there's a period where old habits seem to rise up and that they get clarified and integrated. There's another period where it all seems to be a bit easier. So after about 10 years of meditating, I had another big crisis with my back. And that was when I realized I had to really ask myself, well, what is it that I have not understood? I've been meditating for 10 years, and here I am back in another big crisis. And I realized then that I hadn't figured out how to take my practice out of my formal meditation into my life. And I think that's a pitfall many of us can fall into. So I could meditate fairly well in terms of watching my mind when I meditated, but then during my daily life, my habits were really not serving me well. I tend to have I'm a real boomer buster. So I have a tendency to overdo it and then crash, and overdo it and then crash. So I realized, that's the next thing I need to draw into my mindfulness practice, is how to change my behavior in my daily life. And the other thing that was very interesting is that I realized that I'd subtly been using my meditation practice to try to escape my body rather than to land more fully in my body. And again, I think this is one of the pitfalls. Probably less so now that there's more of us around who are quite experienced and skilled in teaching mindfulness. But back then, none of my teachers had pain. So I was really having to figure it out for myself, how to meditate in a painful body. And yeah, there was this kind of subtle denial and avoidance that had crept into my meditation practice. So when I had my big crisis after 10 years, I realized, yes, there's a foundation here. I have learned that my mind is a resource, and yes, I have trained it to some extent. But A, I need to take it into my daily life, and B, I need to turn towards my direct experience in my meditation practice rather than trying to escape it and avoid it in my meditation practice.
I love that. These are the mindfulness hurdles.
Yeah.
The first hurdle is, how do we just get people to sit, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Even just for 3 minutes. Like, let's just sit for 3 minutes and watch our mind. Then it's, okay, now that we can do that, now let's stay with our mind during the days where it's calm and during the days when it's stormy.
Exactly. Yeah. And to learn not to even necessarily prefer one over the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
To just be with whatever arises with some sense of equanimity and kindness and openness.
That's right. Because so often people realize I had a bad day. I want to go there because I feel better when I sit there and everything's quiet and peaceful. And as you know, it's not always quiet and peaceful in your seated position on the cushion, lying down, wherever you are. And then I think that kind of that third hurdle is, you said it so wonderfully. It's like, how do I take these skills and really bring them into life? Because so often, nowadays it's like, okay, well, I have a meditation, area in my home. Well, like the whole world is the meditation area, basically, right?
Yeah. And the whole point of meditation is to take it into your life, because that's where we live. We have relationships. We want our meditation to make us more loving, more kind, more aware of others. We're in a world of beauty and nature. We want to be kind of saturated in life rather than using our meditation to escape life. And I think that was the thing that it took me a long time to understand.
And the final hurdle you mentioned is the embodiment of the practice. And so often, and I think, the pro and con of an app, so to speak, is that someone's talking to you or someone's guiding you and it's going into your ears. But depending on what their instructions like, it may be a type of approach where we're still separating the mind from the body. And I think especially in the world of chronic disease and chronic pain, it's so important to tie these together. Do you find that there are a lot of approaches that are just focusing on the cognitive aspects of mindfulness and they're not bringing it to that really, mind-body connection aspect?
I think there are some, but to be honest, I think the only ones that are effective are the ones that integrate the mind and the body. And increasingly in my teaching now, I draw out the fact that the head is a limb of the body. Because of course, people think the head is separate from the body, but it's not. It's just like your arms are limbs, your head is a limb. And in your head, you have a brain, which is an organ. And the brain happens to be the place where it feels like thoughts are located. Whether that's true or not, I'm not going to go there. So I might use imagery like just letting your brain be soft and imagine that all your thoughts are having a lie down in the brain, in the body. So I think it's a very Western thing, this mind-body separation, very problematic with chronic pain and chronic disease management, because of course, if your body is hurting, you do not want to be there. Of course, you don't want to be there. So you think, I can just be in my head. I'll just avoid the body by being in my head. But you have a body. We've all got a body. So just trying to blank it out really doesn't work. So mindfulness has this incredible sort of counterintuitive element where we're learning how to come closer and closer to the body, which is where we think the pain resides. So we're having to come closer to the very thing that we don't really want to inhabit. But as we come closer with a loving, kind, soft, gentle awareness, then we come closer to what we think is pain as a thing, as a noun. It's just a label. And you realize it's unpleasant sensations that are flowing and changing all the time, just as the breath is flowing and changing all the time. So you can literally deconstruct this concept of pain, which is entirely mind created as an object, and just rest within the flow of experience moment by moment.
Yeah, it does, of course, take time for people to realize that pain is a construct that we've developed. It takes a long time, even for practitioners who are well trained in psychology, to realize, wow, pain is just a construct. Okay, now how do we start to chip away at that ice block, so to speak?
Yes, exactly.
Until we have something that's more useful.
Yes, and I think even that requires a lot of unpacking.
Yeah.
Because if I heard that as someone with pain who hadn't been introduced to any of this, I'd think they're telling me that my pain isn't real. They're telling me I'm making up my pain. They're telling me I'm useless and a failure. That's where I would have gone years ago. So what's very important to say is that pain is a construct, but the unpleasant sensations, they're real. Mm-hmm. The unpleasant sensations are real. It's just that they're not exactly the same one moment to the next. They're changing, they're flowing. Sometimes when we come really close, we realize, that's a little bit pleasant, actually. Tingling, it's a bit pleasant. My whole back isn't hurting. It's just my lower back that's hurting. What is it? A bit of ache, a bit of stabbing. Tingling, pleasant. Breath, soften. It's changed. So, we're not denying people's experience. That's very important to say. But a flow of unpleasant sensations is a different a whole different notion than my pain as this block of ice, as you say, this thing that you have the sensations, and then we kind of impose upon that a solidity. We make it the enemy, and then we fight it with our minds, and we get tied up in a knot, of course.
Yeah, the struggle with pain is the biggest challenge. And it's interesting because even when people they've found meditation and they have quote unquote bought into it, they're still like, okay, I'm going to meditate, but I'm still going to look for the solution out there, so to speak. There still might be the specialist, or there still might be a new technique that's being developed. When I think, as you mentioned, as you start to deconstruct, like you have this building, right? And floor by floor by floor, you're taking it down. And each floor is a little bit different regarding pain for all of us, right? So one floor may be that injury you had when you were 16. Another floor may be that connection to a relationship in your life. But all that can be unpacked in mindfulness if it's taught appropriately, I think. And as you mentioned before, making sure to teach the mind aspects as well as the body aspects, and of course, integrate them together. So I'm just wondering, as you went from kind of a beginner, and then you did a deep dive and lived, it sounds like in a Buddhist campus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Was there, so at the point where you realized I have to embody this in my life, is that after all of that training?
Well, again, I think it's very gradual.
Yeah.
But the point where I thought maybe I could offer this to others, that was about 2000. And I started to meditate in 1987. So it was 13 years later before I felt ready in myself, because I wanted to come from a very authentic place. And remember, I was having to also invent this because I didn't have, like now, you can go on a training course, of course. But in those days, I was having to invent it for myself. Although I was greatly influenced by John Kabat-Zinn with his work in mindfulness-based stress reduction. But it was, it's a little bit like putting grains of sand on a set of scales. Eventually the set of scales will tip. And I think my mindfulness practice was like that. It wasn't like I had some big aha moment, but it was just gradually, every day, every month, every year, every decade. And then gradually my relationship to my pain has changed. I still have pain. I still have discomfort. I still have unpleasant sensations, but I try to experience them on that sort of basic level, unpleasant sensations, without constructing what I call the secondary suffering, which is all the thoughts about the pain, all the emotions about the unpleasant sensations, all the catastrophizing, all the regrets. All I know is that right now I've got unpleasant sensations in my lower back. Full stop. That's it.
Yeah. It's interesting. A patient came to me a couple of weeks ago and probably read some things on my website and probably did some research of her own. And she came to me with the word pain catastrophizing. And she was trying to understand what it was. She's read some things about it. She's trying to figure out how it relates to pain. And the word pain catastrophizing is always very complicated for people living with pain. And from my training in mindfulness, I asked her, I said, just forget about that word for just a second. See if you can put that out of your mind just for a minute. How do you feel about uncertainty with regard to pain? If you had to move forward knowing there's some uncertainty that this pain may ebb and flow, meaning some days you'll have no pain, other days you'll have significant pain, and most days in between there'll be varying degrees of that. How are you with this uncertainty? And it really I think it helped her with regard to how meditation can help her, because she knows that her mind has an influence on this uncertainty. And yet no one has control over her mind except through her own training and through her, the building of her own awareness. So one of the things I really appreciate about mindfulness is that some of the contemplative lessons actually simplify the complicated science that is coming out now. And I think the complicated science is important. If you're a licensed practitioner, you have to know and have a foundation of that science. But there's this leap from the science to the practice that's really hard for people. And it's interesting because when I look at your work, you did that really wonderfully many years ago before the science was even there.
And what's quite interesting, because one of the things I've always said about our program which is mindfulness-based pain management. And there's lots of mindfulness-based programs now. And a lot of them have been developed by psychologists, and they're very, very good, of course. But I always say my programs come from the inside out. Mm-hmm. So the reason I teach it is because I know it works. And frankly, that's enough. And yeah, I've found science to back it up, and we've got an evidence base. But, I'd be quite happy to change the scientific framework if something better came along, because in a way that is secondary to the fact that it's completely come out of my own experience. And then I've taught it to lots and lots of people, and I know it works. And in a way, that's enough. That's enough. We don't need to have really complicated conceptual models for this work.
So as a licensed professional, I really appreciate it, because I straddle both of those concepts. It's like, okay, where's the research? Show me the research. And then it's like, okay, now that we have the research, how do we build a model that therapists can use in practice? And of course, that's accessible and desirable for the person with pain. And I think the second aspect is actually probably more important. And at times even more challenging, because you can take a mindfulness intervention. I mean, there are research articles out there where they've just done mindfulness for like 3 minutes and show that there's been some change. And I'm like, well, that's great, but how do you bring this and cultivate this into a program that we can use in practice and that's approachable for people with pain? And as you mentioned, the research around mindfulness is not new. I was actually having a conversation with Professor Annette Wilkins, who's a PT professor I interviewed a couple of episodes back, and she teaches mindfulness to her PT students for stress relief, because PT school can be very stressful. And her and I were talking, and we were saying it's incredible that mindfulness is not more embedded in the PT world, because the early research around mindfulness was conducted back in the early 80s.
That's right, yeah.
And we're now 2021. So they say on average it takes 17 years for evidence to hit practice, and in some places this is still really not even hitting. So when you say things like that, I think it's really what people need to hear.
The other thing about mindfulness is that when you really delve into it very deeply, it's profoundly simple. And in the West, we like complexity, it seems to me, very complex models, very intellectual, very academic, but the actual experience is very, very simple. And the experience is come very close to what you're actually experiencing in this moment, physically, mentally, and emotionally, know it, and then make choices using your awareness about how you respond to that. So very, very simply, you're making a choice to open up and release around that experience rather than to resist, contract, and tighten around that experience. That's it at its most simple. And if we can train ourselves to come close and open and release, and come close and open and release, that can profoundly change our lives. Because when we're living with chronic pain and chronic illness, we're living with resistance on the whole. And it's the resistance that's ruining your life, not the pain. It's the not wanting mind. It's the, I don't want this, and the physical tension and the mental agitation and the emotional distress. That's what's damaging and wrecking your life, not the unpleasant sensations. Yeah, they're unpleasant. They're difficult to live with sometimes, but they're bearable on the whole. But it's all the other stuff that's so troublesome. Now, that's a simple concept, very hard to practice, of course. But, you don't need a PhD to get that.
I agree 100%. As people have started to engage more and more with mindfulness, I'm sure before they come to your training, they've tried other types of mindfulness apps, maybe seen the practitioner, etc. What are the pitfalls you've seen with regard to this pop culture of mindfulness that has been created with regard to people who have pain starting to explore this work?
Well, I mean, I'm quite forgiving of all that stuff. I tend to think a little bit of something is better than nothing. Yeah, so we've got all the apps out there now, and I do contribute to some apps. They're not going to bring about depth on the whole, but they might plant a seed. And so when I first started doing this work, people hadn't heard of mindfulness. They come along not really knowing what they were coming to. I mean, obviously, our publicity told them to a certain extent, which is why they came. Whereas now, the whole idea of mental health, mental well-being, training the mind is becoming embedded in our culture. Not nearly enough, but it's beginning. I mean, even with the pandemic, it's so interesting that mental health is on the agenda in a way that I don't think 10 years ago it would have been. It's become much more acceptable to admit, anxiety, PTSD, working with the mind. So on the whole, I think most of them are pretty harmless. The worst they can do is just give someone something that's very shallow and superficial. But as I say, I tend to think something's better than nothing. If someone's really distressed and they find an app and there's some practices there that help them, I think that's good. And then obviously they're going to get much more if they engage with a much more comprehensive program. But I think the popularizing of mindfulness has had some real benefits in terms of popularizing the idea that looking after your mind is, I don't think we still understand that it's as important as looking after your body, but I would hope that over the next 50 years, that will just be completely normal. Kids in school will learn that as their bread and butter.
I believe it's certainly taken the stigma out of mental health challenges.
Yeah, definitely.
In a way that's probably traditional psychology hasn't been able to, unfortunately.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, it's quite interesting here in the UK where male mental health is such an issue because men don't like to go to groups and let's talk about their emotions. I'm totally generalizing there, and apologies to any men who are listening. But it's interesting here that the princes, Prince William and Prince Harry, who are members of the royal family, they've done an amazing work around destigmatizing men talking about their mental health. And I think that's brilliant. And on our courses, we still get predominantly women, which I think is a shame. So I'm hoping that over the next period of time, men will also feel more able to admit to pain, admit to emotional distress, and seize the challenge of mind training, see the potential of the challenge of mind training.
Yeah, I'm always happy when male PTs join my courses related to cognitive behavioral interventions, because it tells me that, okay, there's a change happening.
Yeah.
Because a lot of those male figures and role models, of course, they're working in chronic pain settings, but they're also the coach of their kids' baseball team. And then they start to work mindfulness into just healthy activities, health promotion, sports, which that has a tremendous role. And when you look at professional athletes, there's been a couple articles that have been published recently around that, which I believe has helped in that area. So it is great to see mindfulness as a whole destigmatized, and then you see these little circles that surround it. People are, really kind of grasping onto it, saying, okay, let me learn the foundation, and then how does this fit into my particular niche and my segment of life?
Yeah, and I think with mindfulness that it's still fairly new in our culture. I mean, it started late 70s with the work of John Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness in the secular health-related context. Then around 2000, it really got some traction with the development of MBCT, but it's still pretty new, and it's still pretty white, middle class, predominantly women. So the next evolution is to expand it to a much, much wider demographic. And I think that's coming. I think there's a recognition that's the next thing that those of us who are leaders in the field, we need to look at, well, how do we language things? How do we articulate things? What models are we using to appeal to a much more diverse group? Because of course we've all got minds, and we've all got minds that can cause us tremendous amount of suffering. And we've all got the potential to be free of that.
Yeah, wonderfully said. You mentioned John Kabat-Zinn a couple of times, obviously a big influence on almost everyone who's engaged with mindfulness. How does your program differ from his? His original work, and much of the work around mindfulness-based stress reduction, is typically an 8-week, 2.5-hour intervention. There's a place for that in healthcare, and then there are also enormous challenges in healthcare with a 2.5-hour intervention, because it's very time intensive, both for the practitioner and the person. And a lot of the research around mindfulness points to that you actually don't need that for the intervention to be useful for someone. How does your work differ from some of his early work?
So the program that I developed, it's now called Mindfulness for Health. It was called Peace of Mind originally, and it's under the heading of Breathworks, which is the organization I founded. The Mindfulness for Health course is an 8-week program, but where it differs from MBSR is that the meditations are shorter. MBSR, you do 45-minute meditations. I mean, John Kabat-Zinn's quite hardcore, which I also admire and respect. But if you've got chronic pain, you're not going to meditate for 45 minutes. So we do 10-minute meditations, and we invite people to do those twice a day. Half of our program is compassion-based practices, which I think is really, really important, because if you're living with pain, then cultivating kindness and learning how to be tender towards your experience is really, really important. And that's partly based on my training, my Buddhist training, that I was always taught, do mindfulness of breathing one day and then loving kindness practice the next day. And that had really worked for me to balance out, if you like, the sort of concentration, mind training aspect with emotional training. So I wanted to bring that into my program. And then we've got quite a structured mindfulness and daily life module, because what I've learned from my own experience and the people I've taught who live with pain is boom and bust is a really common phenomenon. So you've got limited resources, limited physical capacity, limited energy, and the tendency to really overdo it when you feel good and then to crash as a consequence. So over 3 weeks, we do a lot around that, and we get people to start using timers, so to time their activities. For example, if I'm working at my computer, I time it for 20 minutes or so, and then I'll have a stretch. And that's not really an MBSR in that very specific way. So traditionally, it's an 8-week program. But then what I've done is I've tried to make that basic concept accessible in lots of different ways. So I've written a book, which has got the program. So of course, you can just do that in your own time over as many weeks as you like. I developed a 10-day course, which is all the same principles, just 15 minutes a day, audio program. All of our work is now online. So we do these global 8-week courses in a group online, and they're really successful and popular. I think there's more that we can do to take the principles and make them more and more accessible in lots of different ways. I think in the mindfulness field generally, there is a recognition of the limitation of the 8-week programs as the only way to deliver mindfulness for all the reasons that you're saying. Yeah. So we've actually got an underlying framework as well behind the 8-week program that can be applied in lots of different ways. And this uses the acronym Be Aware. So B is capital B, little e, and that's being aware of body, thoughts, and emotions as the foundation. So that's the first training. And then the A of aware is acceptance, compassionate acceptance. W is waking up to wonder. So it's recognizing the importance of mindfulness of pleasant experience. So we're not just teaching people how to work with the pain, we're also teaching them how to open up to everything. And then the second A in aware is arising and passing. So it's learning to rest much more with a fluid and open sense of life. And then the R is relating. So taking your mindfulness practice into your relationships. And then the E of aware is engaging with all of your life. So taking your practice into your whole life. So that's the structure of the 8-week program. And of course, you can offer those basic principles in a whole variety of different ways, which we're starting to do more and more of.
When a practitioner or someone with pain completes your program, and so often there are definitely people who come to mindfulness and they have complete transformations. And at times there's a quality to that transformation that is spiritual in nature. And this is definitely left out of most of the research on mindfulness. How do you start to have that conversation with the person you're practicing, whether you're teaching the practice to about, because earlier in the podcast, and I want to come back to it, you mentioned, where are our thoughts? Are they in our head or are they someplace else? And when people start to sit, they realize there's this transcendent sense of self that happens. And I think that transcendent sense of self is really key in the training of meditation, especially with regard to chronic pain specifically. I'm wondering if you started to speak with the people you train, the participants, about that sense of transcendence?
I think that's such a great question. It's such an interesting area because, of course, I came to this with a Buddhist perspective. And in Buddhism, it's set within a spiritual framework, of course. And the goal is, complete sort of vast mind, open heart, interconnectedness, going way beyond a limited, fixed self. And I think probably because I came from that end, and then what I've done with breathworks is translate that into accessible language, so-called secular language. I think I've kind of woven that in slightly mysterious ways. I mean, it is a secular program. I'm not teaching Buddhism, but in a way I can't help but bring some of that perspective into the way I lead things and the way I teach things. And then we run retreats, breathworks, meditation retreats, and we definitely bring it in there. Because, of course, they're not Buddhist ideas as such. They're to do with the human mind and consciousness. And Buddhism just happens to be a tradition, 2,500-year tradition, that's been exceptionally good at articulating the process of training the mind and freeing the mind. But they're universal qualities. Probably in some religions you call it God. I do believe it's all pointing to the same thing. So on our retreats, we can go into that more and then get into dialogue with people. And it's very moving, very touching, because you're right that what happens is as you begin to deconstruct this great, you called it a great building before, of the pain and me and my struggles, you begin to soften everything and dissolve everything. You're not dissolving away to nothing. It's more like you're opening up to something much, much bigger than you'd ever thought was even possible and more beautiful. So I do really love doing the retreats where we can bring in more of that perspective. And we've also got a community of practice now at Breathworks, which is an online platform, online forum, and we can have conversations there. People can write anything in. And then like recently I did a day retreat on mindfulness and the imagination. It was so exciting. And we could begin to just open out the incredible potential of the human imagination. And how does that work with mindfulness? Yeah.
I try to give people more space to talk about those aspects of what their experience is, because it's the positive, the I don't want to say positive and negative. I don't want to frame it that way, but one of the challenges of that we have taken mindfulness and placed it in psychological trials is it becomes a very cognitive process, and the spiritual is taken out of it, or that transcendent sense of self is taken out of it, so to speak. And I don't want to lose that. I always want to bring that into the conversation somehow, because even if you try to tweeze it out of a mindfulness-based approach, it's still there for people.
Yeah, that is so good to hear. If I went along to see a therapist, are you physio-based? Is that your background?
I'm a physical therapist, yeah.
Yes. So if I went to see a physical therapist years ago who'd had that conversation with me, I would have welcomed it hugely, rather than it just being about your body or your mind. But, well, who are you? And about your whole life. What are your values? What's important to you? So I think that's really beautifully put. And that is the danger with the secularizing of these amazing contemplative practices, is it just becomes a cognitive exercise. And that's really a tiny fragment of what we're doing.
That's right. That's exactly right. Because people come, they don't want the pain. They want something else. And I'm always like, well, what if that pain is that stepping stone to something much greater that could potentially come into your life? If you have some tools to allow yourself to move over that hurdle, as we mentioned earlier, move over that hurdle of pain. And then you see changes happen to people. But I'd love to see more of that. We can hold on to some of that contemplative history and bring it into modern approaches. Because I think people are actually, especially as you mentioned, COVID, I think has really changed things. It's caused a lot of people to reflect on, okay, what is my life about now and what I want it to be like going forward. People are changing jobs, they're changing relationships, they're changing their health. And I think these are really important concepts to keep in the training and the conversations with our patients and clients.
Yeah, otherwise it's just another weird Western thing where the head is just this disembodied thing that we're kind of training rather than it being your whole life, your body, your heart, your mind, your values, what's important. And I do agree that the pandemic, absolutely awful though it's been, it is an opportunity, not only for the individual, but also for us as a species. I feel really passionate about that. And it's going to break my heart if we just all sleepwalk back into, trashing the planet the way we were before. I'll be utterly heartbroken. And I realize, well, all I can do is do my little bit. I can't change everybody else, but I can really look at my own behavior and how I live my life. And I'm quite determined to be different going forwards.
Yeah. One of the great things about the mindfulness community is they're very good at identifying populations and groups of people that need support. And oftentimes they're there. So they're in the prisons helping people meditate. They're working with people who have had trauma or don't want to enter the mental health system for trauma treatment. They're working with LGBT communities. They're working with people of color. They're really helping these populations of people grow and expand and overcome things like a pandemic that have potentially adversely impacted them more than people's opportunities and privilege. So it's interesting to watch the communities like that grow and expand.
Yeah, and I think that is the next wave of mindfulness. As I said earlier, we have to get out of our white middle class, predominantly female demographic if we are really going to be impacting the world in the way that mindfulness can, because it is such a universal, simple approach to overcoming all this unnecessary suffering. Yes, there is suffering that's unavoidable in life, of course. I've still got unpleasant sensations in my body. That's a fact. But so much of our suffering is mind created, and we can change that. But it's going to be awful if it's just the white middle class female part of the world that has access to that.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Of course, all of our followers will share this episode with their friends and family on Facebook and LinkedIn, Twitter, and all over social media, because we are 100% followers of mindfulness and meditation, especially for chronic pain. Tell people how they can learn more about you and your products and services.
Okay, so you can go to the Breathworks website, which is www.breathworks-mindfulness.org.uk. Or there's my own website, which is www.vidyamala-burch.com. And you can find out there. And if you want to join our community of practice, it's free. So if you go to the Breathworks website and click on the resources tab, you'll see community of practice there. And I lead a meditation every Tuesday evening, UK time, for 30 minutes that you can join. It's all free. And we'd really welcome anyone who wanted to come and join us and make the most of our resources. Yeah, and also just to say that I mentioned the online courses. So there are these online mindfulness for health courses that are also on the website.
And of course, all the links that Vidyamala mentioned are on the website at the Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. You can check everything out there, or you can just hit rewind on your cell phone and play it back and access those links. I want to thank her for joining us this week and talking about mindfulness and chronic pain. Of course, make sure to share this out with your friends and family, and hop on our mailing list at the Integrative Pain Science Institute.com so I can share with you the latest episode. I'm Dr. Joe Tatta. It's a pleasure, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit integrativepainscienceinstitute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.